In 2022, the Earth's population reached 8 billion people. Elon Musk took over Twitter. Will Smith slapped Chris Rock. The S&P 500 had one of its worst years since 2008. COVID restriction began to lift, and employers tried to put an end to remote work and get employees back into the office. Also in the US and Canada, inflation took a huge leap, jumping from 5.1% in January 2022 to over 8% by June 2022. However, the cost of living in both of these countries, but especially Canada, began to skyrocket. Everyday essentials such as food, utilities, new and used vehicles, gasoline, and especially housing went higher than ever before, and it became more apparent that Canada had a cost of living and housing crisis on its hands. Middle-class Canadians were paying higher taxes than ever before and priced gouged by everything. Sayings such as Canada is a 3-star hotel charging 5-star prices became more popular, echoing the common sentiment as houses that would sell for $400,000 just 10 years ago, or in other countries, were now going for 10 times as much, or $4 million in places such as Vancouver. Canada quickly shot up the charts as being one of the most expensive places to live in the world.
250 square feet for $1,500. We're told it's a good deal. But for the 15 million Canadians that make less than $60,000, this place wouldn't be considered affordable.
With a population that didn't have the income to match, resulting in its people quickly going into debt. According to a recent OECD forecast, Canada is expected to have the slowest growing economy for at least the next decade, and the 3 decades after that finishing dead last compared to other countries.
The world, and especially Canada's residents, have noticed a slow downfall of Canada's economy and with the cost of living.
Canada, the second largest country in the world, once held a proud name and heritage as a top elite country, but lately many Canadian citizens have become upset with the direction Canada seems to be heading.
Not wanting to complain, many Canadians have kept their head up for some time, for several years, and struggled, while their paychecks have remained relatively stagnant over the last decade.
These circles show the housing increases over the last decade in each province. Canada appears to be on a downward spiral as the Canadian economy is causing the cost of living to slowly increase every year for basic necessities such as food, transportation, and especially housing and rental units. Many people feel like the Canadian economy has gone to...
I thought it was chocolate yogurt for so long.
Times are so desperate that people flock from cities that are considered impossible to afford, like Vancouver and Toronto, to other cities and provinces now driving up the cost of living for residents in those locations.
Across Canada, Vancouver wins the prize for least affordable, followed by Toronto. Edmonton and Calgary, our cheapest cities, rated moderately unaffordable.
I've lived in Canada all my life working as a Canadian corporate accountant, and I've never seen the cost of living or housing this insane before. Many people are tired of riding this chaotic cost of living roller coaster in which everything seems to get higher and higher and become more outrageously overpriced.
I'm working like 3 jobs right now. Like, I'm not saving anything really, but the cost of living is outrageous in Canada.
There is no more cost of living. There is only cost of surviving.
Hard and expensive to live here.
Rent, gas, groceries, just any form of goods and service is insane.
In a recent Ipsos poll, 63% of Canadians who don't own a home or giving up on ever becoming a potential homeowner. Is now just a fleeting dream.
This is what $1 million gets you in Toronto and in the greater Vancouver area. It doesn't get you as much in Canada's most expensive cities.
You know those signs that say, in an emergency, break the glass? Well, it's time to break the glass.
That's Carolyn Rogers, the Senior Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada. And yeah, she says things are bad.
The Canadian economy has been severely contracting over the last several years. Everything has increased in price. This includes houses, food, gasoline, clothing, and these sharp increases started right around the year 2022 or at the end of COVID. The crisis began with factory closures, transportation delays, and labor shortages, all reducing the supply for many products and drove up production costs as a result. Also, the war in Ukraine contributed to a stiff increase in commodity prices. The US was experiencing, and still is to some extent, its own cost of living crisis. However, they are starting to pull away as Canada continues to slowly deteriorate. Two primary reasons for this are increased productivity, stronger per capita GDP, and because interest rates don't have quite the same impact as they do in Canada, as most Americans have a 30-year mortgage, so it doesn't have the same impact as it does with Canadians with a 5-year term mortgage. Now, I don't want to sound super negative about this, as normally I'm a very positive person, and Canada can work its way out of this. However, it's going to be a real struggle.
If you don't think Canada's a sinking ship, you're an idiot. We now make less per capita than people in Mississippi. We're worse off than the people in the worst off state in the US.
Yeah.
It's a race to the bottom. The OECD predicts that we'll be the worst performing country in the developed world for the next 3 decades.
People born between 1946 and 1965 qualify as baby boomers, and they are leaving and creating a huge gap in the Canadian workforce. Well-intentioned immigrants are being brought in to help relieve some of the burden when baby boomers begin to retire and address the growing labor shortages, particularly in needed industries such as healthcare and home building.
According to CMHC, immigration has been a significant driver of rental demand in recent years, and is partially responsible for tipping the scales heavily towards the demand side. Some people view this as cheaper labor, as many have filled lower-paying minimum wage jobs. However, those qualified, educated immigrants that do come to Canada are not having their degrees being properly recognized. Regarding the cases with those less skilled immigrants, many are being exploited by employers looking to save a few bucks.
It's created increased competition for many of the jobs that non-permanent residents often work in. They're often in lower paying areas of the service sector.
With Canada experiencing a surge in population, employers are becoming more selective and almost in some cases impossible to please on who they hire. Many current residential Canadians are finding it near impossible to secure steady employment, such as students looking for a summer job. Also, many seasoned professionals wanting to increase their net income or get a second part-time job to help battle the enormous challenge of the cost of living are experiencing the exact same thing.
According to Bloomberg, in Ontario, Tim Hortons took on 58 temporary foreign workers in 2019, but last year it was over 700.
This has been a big transformative change. This is tens of thousands of extra temporary foreign workers, particularly at coffee shops and convenience stores, ice cream places, and that kind of workplace.
The surplus of people is causing more of a demand for jobs and housing than is currently available. There are similar stories in the US, the UK, and Australia. However, Canada is leading the pack when it comes to impossible affordability. Just look at housing. Now, I hate when people oversimplify a problem, as this is a complex problem. First, we must understand how we got here, and second, there are many moving parts to this problem that are difficult to solve. There are people at all ends of the spectrum. There are young people and current renters who are wanting home prices and interest rates to drop so that they can get into the market. There are also current investors and homeowners that want prices to remain relatively where they are so that they don't lose 1/3 of their investment. However, they want the payments to become more affordable. And then there's everything else in between you could imagine.
December 22nd, 1989, The Simpsons first aired, depicting how a middle-aged man with no college education, having only one full-time job, no side hustle, and a stay-at-home wife, is easily able to support a family of 5 on just one income and still own a decent-sized average home. At one time, 35 years ago, this would have been considered middle class. Now, by today's standards, The Simpsons would easily be considered to be upper class, and their home would sell for about $1.5 million in Toronto. In Vancouver, this house would net $4 to $5 million easily.
Number 1. Housing price increases and population growth. Canada is trying to cover up its struggling economy with a temporary patch of just adding more people to falsely boost its GDP. Population growth in Canada is both helping and hurting the Canadian economy.
This sudden surge in Canada's population growth, especially around its popular urban centres like Vancouver and Toronto, has led to increases in housing and the cost of living from what was once very expensive to now completely overinflated prices, not just for homes, but a split over into condo and apartment rentals causing rent prices to increase. A study by Demographia, which examines international housing affordability, has deemed Vancouver and Toronto as impossibly unaffordable. A report of 94 major markets in 8 countries including Canada, China, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, the United States and the United Kingdom, and Toronto ranks number 11 and Vancouver number 3. Big surprise, as the most unaffordable cities in the world. So, if a city ranks 3 or below it is affordable, and the higher it is, the more unaffordable.
In Canada, it is so bad that people just swarm to cities and places that are labeled only moderately unaffordable because they don't have to deal with the headache of big cities like Toronto and Vancouver that are labeled as impossible to afford. This is in part due to affordability housing neglect by the government for decades, and now the chickens are coming home to roost. Just look at Calgary. It is seeing a severe increase in population. Unfortunately, for many of the people living there, this is driving up their cost of living, but they don't have much control or choice over what happens with that. In some urban areas, certain landlords have no choice but to raise the rent because they have to keep up with the cost of living themselves. Other landlords, I'm sure, are simply price gouging. And there are other scenarios with certain landlords allegedly trying to stuff 3 to 8, even 12 people into a single house, trying to take advantage of people because they just need a place to live or stay, or they're new to Canada and just want affordable housing. Other people are getting creative and sleeping in campgrounds. This is eventually leading to a spike in the cost of living in those locations that people are moving to. Pride in the Canadian economy has begun to drop and decline. Canadians are fleeing Toronto and Vancouver, and a new poll says that 30% of Canadians are considering leaving Canada altogether. Number 2, the problem keeps spreading.
People in almost every province have been affected by the cost of living. Places that were once extremely expensive like Toronto and Vancouver have their cost of living accelerated and reclassified into the impossible to afford category. Any place in Canada that is still moderately affordable, and I use that term loosely, is quickly pumped and promoted by the federal government to everyone. Hence, of course, people flock to those locations, driving up the cost of living. Who can blame them, as everyone needs to be able to live, but for the current residents in those areas, their cost of living will skyrocket and there is nothing they can do. For context, Alberta is the fastest growing province, and 30% of Canadians are considering either leaving or relocating to places such as Alberta. So, Alberta and other places may one day suffer the same fate as what, unfortunately, people in Toronto have had to endure.
Number 3, wage stagnation. It may be the worst kept secret that Canadian wages have not kept up with the cost of living.
Wages have only grown by approximately 1.5 to 1.8 what they were almost 3 decades ago, and yet the prices of homes have grown almost 10 times what they were if we compare 2024 to, say, 1995. One of the chief reasons for this is the lack of productivity and stunted GDP per capita. In a 2019 study, the CSLS did a comparison between Canada and the US. Americans were on average richer. However, comparing the upper quadrant, if you were a high-income earner, you made more in the US compared to your counterpart in Canada. But if you were a low-income earner, you made less in the United States than their counterpart in Canada. The difference resulting from the labor productivity gap between the two countries.
In the US, the average worker makes about $80,000 a year. Compare that to Canada, where the average worker makes only about $60,000 a year. That's 30% more you earn in the US if you account for differences in taxes and the cost to purchase homes, vehicles, groceries, you name it, is cheaper as well in America. So it's no wonder that a lot of promising rising applicants that currently live in Canada would rather move to the US and work for companies there, receive a higher salary and pay less for items than live in Canada, receive a lower salary and be taxed to death. It's what is called brain drain.
The US is Canada's largest trading partner. However, being so closely tied to the US does have its drawbacks. If the US economy enters a recession, usually Canada follows suit. The same thing usually occurs with interest rates. However, despite experiencing their own housing and debt crisis, the US is pulling away from Canada, increasing by 5% and trending upward, at least as far as productivity and innovation is concerned, while Canada continues to decline, contracting 1.1%.
Number 4. Inflation, taxes, and debt levels. The Canadian government has been trying to battle inflation very hard because there is nothing, I maintain, that will kill a country faster than inflation. This is and always will be a top concern of the government. The Canadian government's current debt level is at nightmare proportions. At the very least, streamline your policies so that you're not just dumping more people and increasing taxes to fund a broken economic and political system that is outdated and turns very slowly. Higher taxes keep funding and feeding a cumbersome machine that keeps making bad financial decisions and increasing its debt level. There was a proposed budget in Toronto to replace 2 aging ferries. These are very old ferries, they need to be replaced. It was originally proposed for $25 million. This budget has now ballooned to $92 million just to replace 2 ferries. Folks, we can't afford this. We really can't. I understand that the original ferries were maybe going to be diesel, and now they're switching to some sort of hybrid ferry. That $92 million, like that's almost 4 times as much. We just don't have the resources or the budget to spend on these kind of things. We need new ferries, yes, of course, but let's start making smart decisions with our money. If the government has to resort to printing more money to feed its budgetary desires and help with quantitative easing, it devalues all the dollars that are currently in circulation. Number 5, healthcare. Healthcare is a prime example of something that needs a complete overhaul and to be severely re-examined. I remember when it was so hard to get a doctor and I figured, okay, this is just because of COVID. There's a challenge getting in to see doctors. But the problem continued for months, years after COVID ended. So the system is broken. Number 6, a shift in priorities.
In the 1990s to around 2013, Canada was highly regarded as a shining example of a robust, dependable economy, even briefly passing the United States, in for a short period along with Australia. However, since the fall of oil and gas in 2008, Canada's resource economy has shifted away from oil and natural gas and began putting more of an emphasis on real estate in 2014. When the housing bubble burst in 2008 in the US, virtually nothing happened in Canada. Canadians felt immune to the economic recessions and began turning more towards REITs for their investments, leading Canada's real estate to grow in major cities by double digits year over year. People invested less into the stock market and more into real estate every year. Canadian companies are still experiencing less investment, both foreign and domestic. The ROI generated from Canadian businesses was not invested back into the business, but more into real estate. Outside investors also saw Canada as an opportunity to invest into Canadian housing, not into Canadian businesses. Soon, housing was begun to be viewed by many, including the government, solely as an investment, and not as a place where people actually live.
Number 7, a change in attitude towards Canada. And see, all of this is creating a shift in attitude towards how people feel about Canada. Polite, happy Canadians that one time had a lot of pride in their country are starting to shift and become more cranky, irritated, frustrated, and overwhelmed with the cost of living. What at one time was assumed that, yeah, if a person works hard, they put in effort, they could own a home, sure. But now it seems like that's being put on a shelf reserved for the ultra-wealthy. Now, all of this isn't all the government's fault, but certain areas are, and it's hard to know who to trust. Do you trust this guy and, well, with all the mistakes and blunders he's made, or do you trust someone who's never came into office before and can talk a big game, but I don't know. I'm just kind of want out of this severe problem and don't want to play the political game. I just want a solution to be found. I will say that all of this is culminating into frustration and anger with Canada's economy, the cost of living and housing being number 1 and 2 of the primary concerns of Canadians. In a recent poll in 2028, 62% took pride in the economy. That has now fallen to people who feel pride in the economy in 2024 to only 32%. Number 8, poverty level increases. Poverty. I have to say, as a Canadian resident who's lived here all my life, that I am very unhappy with what is happening right now. In that 1 in 4 people, 25% of the Canadian population, live in poverty. That's out of 8 essential items right here that 1 in 4 Canadians cannot afford 2 or more of these items. So you have to choose, do I eat regularly and healthy this month, or do I put a roof over my head? 1 in 4 Canadians, 25%, are having to make this choice every month on what they can afford to spend and buy and what they can maybe stretch and do without this month. Essential needs. Food banks have doubled, at least, maybe even tripled in some areas, trying to feed people that walk in. From sunup to sundown, they're completely full and they're often out of food. Like, this is record levels that they're seeing. I always think back to that clip with Jeff Daniels, you know, where he's talking in the newsroom about America. He's referring to America, not Canada. And it used to apply 10, 15 years ago only to kind of aspects of America. But lately, the more and more that I listen to it, it starts to reflect more of what it seems is happening in Canada. And it's pretty disheartening.
You're saying? Yes. There is absolutely no evidence to support the statement that we're the greatest country in the world. We're 7th in literacy, 27th in math, 22nd in science, 49th in life expectancy, 178th in infant mortality, 3rd in median household income, number 4 in labor force, and number 4 in exports. Sure used to be. We stood up for what was right. We fought for moral reasons. We passed laws, struck down laws for moral reasons. We waged wars on poverty, not poor people. We sacrificed, we cared about our neighbors, we put our money where our mouths were, and we never beat our chest. First step in solving any problem is recognizing there is one. Enough?